Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Giamario here with you again for our monthly video blog. Now, today we're going to actually tackle a topic that I've only had the opportunity to share this with individuals, clients, and in smaller groups. And it's the topic of death. You know, how our school looks at physical and shamanic death and rebirth, and then how we would look at that within the framework of the entire paradigm. And here with me today is former president of the school and now council member Mary Kern, and also another council member, Shiva Faranpour, who is our course coordinator, manager of the different upcoming courses. And they're going to assist and share as part of this inquiry. And it occurs to me when I was planning this out that this is because this can't be a really long video blog, that this is sort of the prototype of a future longer workshop because it's such an important topic. So let's look at the summary here first. I always like to look at the points we're going to cover before we actually cover them. And we're waiting here we go. So here are the things that I'm hoping we'll have a chance to delve into. Can physical death be seen in the chart? The difference between physical death and shamanic death. The similarities between birthing and deathing. Are there astrological initiation cycles connected to death? Transits and timeline are both need to be considered there, as well as something that Mary brought to my attention before we started this, that it's also does include, for example, the charts of the person who has passed and a loved one, you know, whether it's parent and child or whether it's, you know, a husband and wife and so on. And then the counseling approaches of totems, and then the hoary issues of suicide and abortion. Now, I know a lot of people maybe don't know that word. It means like a word that's been used for centuries, and which has always been controversial. You know, so that's why we put that in there a bit. So first and foremost, let me just say, and within our paradigm, there are certain things we feel that are held in sacred trust by great mystery. And much of that has to do with the fact that the deterministic approach to astrology, as used for thousands of years in places like India, they would always say, "Don't you want to know when you die?" And then they would have this technique that would say, "This you're going to die when you're, you know, whatever year or month." And I think that's tied into a universe that is just uh, like a machine. And I basically value, and we in this paradigm in the school value a certain um, uh, openness to the fact that great mystery is actually in charge. And so that the last thing I would ever do is to try to say, oh, you have death coming up, but rather to look at what initiatory processes a person is in. So, but and now having said that, though, if you have a loved one who's passed, or if you're working with a client who is bringing that to your attention about someone in their life who's passed, there is a way that you can look and see where that person who passed was at in their cycles, and it helps to know a little bit about what their life was like up to that point. And I've had just innumerable cases of where looking at it that way has really assisted the person who's grieving to understand what it is that was taking place for that person. It can really be helpful. You know, how do you prove these things? You can't really, but the experience I've had is that it's more like in that soul to soul encounter. there's something that matches intuitively, where the individual feels there's something correct about that, and it relieves them of uh, maybe as much concern that they might have had, as if like death is such a massive tragedy or something. Um, so which actually then a couple other like starting points here. As is understood in our paradigm, particularly through the Venus and Mars cycles, there is a distinction between physical death and shamanic death. And actually, anyone who's gone through what is called shamanic death and rebirth, there a lot of times they have shared with me, and I can say this from my own experience, that it can be so overwhelmingly excruciating that you would wish that it might be physical death, but then you don't get out of it that easy, so it's a different kind of surrender. um, and the I mean, compare that to how maybe someone who dies in their sleep, in a very natural time period where they would pass. That's very different than a shamanic death and rebirth experience, which is, and I will also say that when a person is deeply in that experience of shamanic death and rebirth, which can happen with Venus and Mars cycles, it can happen with Plutonian cycles, that there is that point where you sometimes cannot even tell the difference between whether it's the surrender of actually dropping the body, or whether it's the surrender, which is just letting go of who you thought yourself to be at that point. Um, there's more we go into about this in the Venus, the Journey to Anana revision class, which just gives some strategies. Like if it's a shamanic death and rebirth, you actually need to have friends, family, clan to drum you back, quote unquote. So that soul knows it's really not the time that they actually physically die, but to bring them back into the next phase of their life. Also, this third point, the similarities between birthing and deathing. Um, this comes from the experience many of us have had, including myself, working with people who do different forms of rebirthing, breath work, different holotropic breath work, shamanic breath work, things like that, where um, you get to a certain point in the birthing experience that actually the surrender is pretty equivalent between birthing and deathing. So there's a surrender that happens when you get born. And then, 99.9% of people when they get born don't have any idea what they were before. So it's like a surrender to be, oh, a whole new life without even remembering what happened before. And or when you die, you're deciding to let go of what your life was. So there's a very interesting similarity there. Um, as we go through this, and we will be looking at some chart examples, are there astrological initiation cycles connected to death? It's a worthy inquiry. And that would include transits, as well as where a person is in their timeline, the shamanic timeline of our life. A very important thing to discuss is the counseling approaches we would use with regards to someone dying. Or even, I've even had this happen with a client that that's not dying, but they're like, say, coming into a Saturn cycle. And so basically, often the counseling technique is saying, do you feel like you're in alignment with your life purpose themes? And so then we look at the Saturn cycle, for example, and say, well, if you don't, no, I'm not in alignment with it. This is not the life I want to live. They said, well, if you don't make certain changes within the course of the Saturn cycle, well, then it's just going to stay the same. I'm not saying you're going to die, but things are going to stay the same, right? and they'll say, no, 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 there's no way that that I would want to do that. So you're actually, so the whole counseling technique, this is just one example, is to tune a person into their life purpose themes. And then they can navigate the cycles in harmony, in connection, in rapport with great mystery. And then also, I'd like to bring up maybe near the end of our conversation about these issues associated, the issue of suicide and the issue of abortion, of which I have some clear views on it. They're not considered to be views that are dogmatic or doctrinaire, but just something that comes from my own experience of looking at this. So that's an example. This is like an overview of our topic. And you can actually see here that this is like prototypical, a prototype for a much more extensive, you know, seminar or even couple-day workshop, right? So anything that either of you would like to bring up so far?
I would just say that being able to explain to a loved one perhaps an obvious purpose that their loss was really bringing them, or releasing from them any sense of entanglement. I mean, I've had that happen where there was just great relief, where they spent a long part of their life really being haunted by something, and then seeing it so clearly on the charts of their loved one and themselves that this was totally intended, this was the way it was supposed to work, and it was really neat to be able to do that for somebody.
Yeah. And actually, it reminds me, Mary, of something I didn't say here that should be said at the top here. When looking at the death chart, it's really an inquiry, a soul-to-soul inquiry, and not a judgment. I mean, it's really important not to make a judgment about it, you know, and that's one of the harder things to happen when you're in a major grief process, you know, like I'm responsible for their death or something like that. Or the astrologer, you know, saying, well, the reason they did is because of this, you know, like some sort of dogmatic thing. It's an inquiry. And I have noticed that such an inquiry can be helpful. Shiva.
Thank you for having me here, Danielle. I'm probably the youngest here, but I have had my own share of dealing with the subject personally and also helping others. So, I mean, my birth name is Shiva, so that put me right in track for studying the subject, being the God of death and destruction. So I'm grateful to be here and be able to bring maybe, you know, an idea from where I'm standing in life about the subject.
Well, it occurs, thank you, and I'm looking forward to that. It occurs to me that I want to actually start with maybe two examples. And it was actually while you were working hard there, Mary, coming up with our slide, Shiva had brought to my attention something about the so-called 27 Club. And then I wanted to also bring up about what happened, probably the experience that I learned the most from about the subject, which was the death of my first wife. So see, the whole thing of and this brings up like one of the cycles that is important to know about, which is the time period between age 27 and 28. And it is something which actually Steiner referenced, but it became rather popular in the culture back in the 70s and 80s. And it was well known for my generation. It was called the 27 Club, and it had to do with how many of musicians and artists, and there's really well-known ones. But if you saw the long list of the ones that are in that club, it's way more than just the well-known ones. And of course, just for I'm referring to like Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix. But then in the more recent times, it was Kurt Cobain. And but there's a whole long list of others. And you know, how does one look at that? And this is just one example. Um, it has to do also with the spirit of that time, where there was an artistic and spiritual, how do we put it,
Renaissance.
well, no, it was no, not that. It's just like there was a template. Many of them were falling, which would came from the work of Arthur Rimbaud. They all were followers of Arthur Rimbaud. And the view there was is that it's your responsibility as an artist to extend your nervous system as far as possible. And it doesn't even matter if you only have 2 or 3 years to live. You know, so it's just to take it to the limit. You know, it's kind of like that old expression, it's better to burn out than to fade away, you know. Now, that was like the cultural view at that point. But if you look at the individual charts, the whole point of 27 to 28 is that what decisions you make at that point determine whether the Saturn return is going to be easy or difficult. And so what happened with the 27 Club, based upon my own research into their charts, is there is a distinction between their lineage identity and their current life purpose identity. And they were addicted, shall we say, to the lineage identity, and were not willing to let go of that identification or attachment. And so therefore they did, you know, I mean, what, self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, we'll take it to the limit. And no matter what the addictions are, or whatever the damage to the nervous system or whatever it might be. So that's just one example. Does this mean that if you have a client 27 to 28, you're going to say, if you don't change your life, you're going to die? No, it's just this describing how it's important to, and this is where our paradigm is so important, is that you can make that distinction between their potential over-identification with their lineage and whether or not they're too attached to that and cannot shift into what current life intent is. And there are other time periods where such a challenge could be presented. Age 45 to 46. Actually, nodal cycles are frequently associated with that, as are Saturn cycles. Now, and I think you said, Shiva, that you experienced the same thing with your first partner.
Yes, that's correct. Not to mention that that was also something that you talked about before the call, so how somehow it really relates. And I guess you mentioned at the beginning that it relates to the chart of the loved ones. And I was going through right before the start of my own Saturn return.
Well, the next example that I want to give is what happened with my first wife. Now, this shows her natal chart as well as what happened at the time of her drowning. And this was such an experience for me, because actually, just to be full disclosure on it, we had already decided not to be married, but she was actually the closest family. Basically, my relationship with her included friendship, lover, marriage, and then close kin. You know, basically I talked to her every day, even when we were not married anymore. And so she was living in Hawaii, and I was living in Arizona. And I had visited her just before the time of her death, just before Christmas. And we had arranged this entire plan where she would actually move back to Arizona to be around loved ones, because she was all alone over there. And so I was trying to get a sense of her chart. And you can see she was in a 9-month Saturn cycle to her home and roots. Saturn 21 Virgo, IC 28 Virgo. And also she was in a cycle of Uranus to the midheaven. But even more important, I mean, a longer cycle, not just the exact alignment on that day. But look at the nodal. She was also in her nodal return. If you can see that, 9 Aquarius, 13 Aquarius, and also she was in her Venus return also, and you can see the events that were happening there when she passed. Now it turned out that that day after Christmas in Hawaii, they had a record-breaking rainstorm, and that morning she went out by the river where the water was coming down, and I went back there to the place where she drowned, and it even had a date on the on the bridge that was when it was built, which was the date of her birth. You can't make this stuff up. But I had discerned before that the meaning of Saturn on your IC and the nodal return was her movement to the new phase of her life back to Arizona. And but what it turned out, and then you have to know a little bit, look at her chart. I mean, Aquarius moon, Mars in Aquarius, Venus in Aquarius, and a Plutonian, Pluto opposing that stuff, that the story of her life is that she was so sensitive that she couldn't even be around living in a place next to electrical power lines. And she was so sensitive. And so therefore, we had to keep moving all the time to get her away from electricity, you know. And so I thought, oh yeah, well, this is obvious. This is when, in fact, even helped her box up all her stuff. That we even had a flight booked for her. But what happened was that she, and I had psychics look at this, and you know, sensitives look at this, that this is a situation called accidentally on purpose. You know, where so basically the water was racing down, and so she basically decided to just jump into the river. And basically she was met by dolphins when she jumped into the river out into the bay. And I had to go identify the body, and the detective said, we almost never do this, but he showed me the picture of what she looked like when they pulled her out of the bay, and she was in bliss. He said, we've never actually seen someone who we pulled out of the bay that looks so happy. And so now when I've looked back on this situation, it's like she wanted to, she couldn't make, she basically was too hard for her to be in density, and she went back to being an angel. That's how I perceived it, and that really helped my own process. Although this is the woman who gave me the gift of personal love, and she also gave me the gift of grieving, because this had an effect on me that that even the death of my parents didn't have on me. You know, that I didn't really feel very much when they passed, but when this happened, because you know I genuinely loved her, and when she passed, and she genuinely loved me, and her gift was really that. But it's hard for me to. I look at it as accidentally on purpose. I mean, a lot of people would say, "Oh yeah, this was a suicide." Well, no, it was a completion. She went home as this during the nodal return and the Saturn on her IC for the first time in 30 years. You know, so this was like quite a setup, and boy, did I ever learn from this. So there's just this is my greatest teaching, actually, as far as this whole issue of death charts. But of what I'm saying, what my own discernment of the meaning of it is something that's between my soul and hers. You know, it's like I would not project that onto everyone who would go through a death in a cycle like this. But knowing the meaning of the nodal return, realignment to original intent, and knowing Saturn on the home and roots part of the chart while you're being in a long Uranian cycle to the midheaven, not to speak of the individual stuff that was happening. This happened with look, I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. It was actually a moon, I mean, Pluto, Mars conjunct in the underworld. The moon was wildly out of bounds when that all happened. These are all things that I've picked up on. So that's the main example I wanted to give here. So I know Mary, you had one you wanted to take a look at, and we'll turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you. I actually had a couple of them, and I definitely had one that was in the same vein as what you just spoke. But I think the reason I included these others these are people that I knew personally, but it shows how Uranus can be involved, and it is involved in so many that I've seen. I thought it was so interesting how many of the alignments that were really reflecting what was going on at this time was that Pisces seems to be involved a lot. I don't know if that's all, just in my family, or if that is straight across the board. But Uranus was conjunct this the daughter's Jupiter in Pisces at the same time that this occurred, which kind of suggested that the death was expanding the daughter's spiritual dharma as well. So that's one of those charts between charts, and how that gets how that works out. Here we've got.
Well, wait a second, Mary, question. So the inner chart, the person was born in 1918.
The inner chart is the person who is born in 1918. And the outer chart is what I call a transition. I don't like the word death. I don't really see it as death. I just see it as we evolve. I don't see it as beginning and
dropping the body.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
So that's what I mean by death, physical death, dropping the body. Okay. Now, but what I'm not clear about is, so is this the death of the person born in 1918?
Yes, it is. It's the death date. It's
all right. So one of the things I would first look at would be
where they're
how
at.
How old the person was.
83, I believe.
All right. So
turning
that's
4 in 2 days.
So that's the Jupiter return and the Uranian, and moving into the Uranian opposition. Now, that's what's very interesting about that is that Rajar felt that that was the archetypal lifespan of a human being, the Jupiter Uranian thing between 83 and 84. And I personally, upon further review, I think it's really 3 Saturn returns. But if you wanted to kind of leave on a expanded sense, as you're suggesting, it would certainly be the Jupiter-Uranus combo, 83 to 84.
That's great. That was one of the questions I had, is if there were, when there are multiple ones, if they are specific combinations that tend to foretell or reflect what's going on. Yeah, so Uranus was also squared to Venus and the sun at that time as well. Okay, and here's one. This is again 83 and 10 months old at the 7th Jupiter return.
There we have it again.
Right. And this is actually my mother and father, but the Chiron was also transiting to the sun. I didn't have an exact birth time. I had the date. So it suggests that Saturn, there's a lot of Saturn stuff going on, but I wouldn't be able to really validate that with the angles without that exact time. And again, you've got Uranus over here, which isn't exact. So my next question is to confirm, this is like 4 degrees. Would you consider that?
Well, because Uranus, because 7 Jupiter cycles fit into 1 Uranian cycle, and actually I look at the 83-84 time period as being the combination of the two. And I mean, often when the person is in the exact Uranus return, Jupiter will still be in play, but it's like Jupiter and they're both working together. And actually, what makes this Jupiter return so important, it's the only true Jupiter synodic return, which happens at or near the birthday. Well, the Uranian return, it is not right, it's not a synodic one. It's not right at the birthday. So this, I look at this as like an overall life phase. And I mean, the speculation, the inquiry on that is that if you wanted to have a expanded kind of completion, that's a rather good time to drop the body.
And the Pisces moon was on their moon in Pisces, which I hadn't
Right.
even noticed till right now.
Fantastic. I mean, that's like a surrender.
I was noticing that also the moon had something to do on the other chart, on Debbie's chart, Danielle, where it was almost a new moon because the moon was on her sun. And now
Right.
I then realized that there was the moon here returned.
Right.
Mhm.
Oh, indeed, and also you can see the relationship there between the nodal axis with her Venus and Moon conjunction when she was born. So yeah, quite a whether she was plotting it this way or not, and I don't think so, because you can see what a Uranian person she actually was, you know, being born with Uranus on the ascendant. That I would, my sense would be that she was in such despair and overwhelm, and that she really did want to go home, but then she was hit by lightning, as it were, and it's like, okay, I'm going into the water.
That's beautiful. With this particular one, she actually passed in her sleep. So that was what you were saying. I mean, that was a very different way to go, and a very soft way to go, soft landing. Okay, we've got this is someone who just turned 76. Again, Uranus is transiting the sun, the moon is transiting her Mars in Pisces, and the North Node is transiting Jupiter in Cancer.
Well, that's also the completion of that time frame of 74 and a half to 76. You know, which in other words, this is just a few days after the end of her nodal reversal, which occurs at the 76th birthday, which is the Metonic, which is the point. So on her birthday, the sun-moon angle would have been the one she was born under. So this is another, this would be like a more not a Jupiter-Uranian thing so much, but it's more like another point that could be discerned as a completion. But it might be a completion that would be based upon, well, I don't really have the physical, emotional, or psychological wherewithal to have a complete new phase. Because you remember that this is right smack in the middle of the winter phase of life. You know, so this would, I think, have more to do with the assessment about, am I really up for having another, you know, another 10 years or another time, a whole other period to get to the third Saturn return. I do notice, Mary, here you've included also the Piscean element, you know, happening. So maybe we can imagine, well, that person might have realized that they were going to have an opportunity to let go at the node during the nodal, the Metonic, you know, during her birthday, and then was just, I guess you could say, waiting for the Pisces moon, because you can see a Capricorn moon chart is going to be pretty stubborn.
Very. Double Capricorn. Well, she died very suddenly, and it was a medical issue that was not on the radar at all. And it just was a period of just being sedated so she could pass. And she was happy about that, because she wanted, she had a deep spiritual belief. One.
Well, I could certainly imagine that a person, is this a different one?
This is a different
I'll
one.
go back
This
to
is
the other one for a
okay,
moment.
that was the age 61. This one was the 76.
Yeah, so I would think this individual would not be all that happy about having to have a lot of physical pain.
Yeah.
And so again, this is just intuition here, that there are some Capricorn moons in my experience, even the ones that get beyond age 89, and they're often the ones that just stick around out of pure stubbornness. They want to make sure that they outlive everyone else. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of grace in her not having to go through that.
Yeah.
It's like all those stories, and I've had many clients that have shared this, where they have a parent who is, like they're allegedly been given a stage 4 terminal diagnosis. 3, 4, 5 years later, they're still there, and the family is still completely just there taking care of them for 4 or 5 years. And while it's not, it might not be considered to be the most loving thing in the world to say, but these individuals say, "Come on, get on with it. You know, why are you being so stubborn? And you've roped us into this for 5 years when you told us you only had 4 months." You know, so I mean, there's a lot of complications, but that is really based upon the family dynamic. Actually, that's why you have to kind of look at the whole family in order to be able to get those kind of insights. I've had those people tell me that. Anyway, go ahead, Mary. One more, and then I wanted to maybe cover a couple of those other topics.
Would you say, Danielle, that for a Capricorn moon, it can be also partly that they just their whole life, the lineage, been responsible to take care of others, and sometimes in moment of transition, they're afraid to let go because although they can take care of anybody and everybody's taking care of them, but that's the attachment I've experienced.
Totally, and that's because they're going to lose the only job they knew they had.
That's interesting because her Dharma was in Cancer and she was the biggest nurturer that you could ever imagine. So having the North Node hitting that and reactivating that when she left is real interesting. Yeah.
Well, my mother, when she was passing away, the Capricorn moon, Venus, Danielle's in her chart, a lot of, and Saturn also there. So very difficult getting out of the Capricorn, and we're not sure of her rising, but she was in bed for last year and she couldn't move. But when I went there to take care of her and visit her, she was constantly telling us where to get what in the kitchen and how to take care of the guests.
Oh my.
Right.
She could not let go of what her function or what her identification with what her job was. It's a purely speculative, but because I'm not going to try to say that every case is the same, but there are some Capricorn moon types or Saturn dominant individuals that I've known that will end up getting either dementia or what is called Alzheimer's. And actually it gives, again, not every case here at all, but I've been told by family members and when these circumstances have arisen among clients, that that was their desperate strategy to let go and surrender and to just allow themselves to not have to manage things. And what I've heard is that a lot of times what is available to an Alzheimer's person, again, not in all cases, is that they're more heartful.
Right.
That is so, I really appreciate you talking about that because I could really see how that individual would have never given up the ghost in terms of the Capricorn rising and moon and the Dharma in Cancer. I mean, they were so steadfast on that being graciously taken out quickly would be their only way to surrender. So that's interesting.
And here's this one more example here that's on the same theme, Mary, which is the seeming, in some of these you brought up the seeming contribution of Neptune and Pisces, and the Neptune connection, which is like the offering of grace from the cosmic mother, from the Holy Mother.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think maybe, have you seen that a lot, or is it specific to some family constellations? I don't know, but
It
what
seems to be yours. I think
does,
probably each family group will have their own one that might show up the most, and then how those individuals in the family grieve it, whether they take it personally or not. You know, these are all part of the way of looking at the charts of all the family members and how they relate to the grieving. Um,
this individual was born during that Neptune, Saturn, Uranus conjunction. And it's interesting that the day they left, all those planets were pretty much in play on their chart. They had the Saturn square Venus had just completed just prior, but all the rest of them are bringing them home, I guess.
yeah.
And then the super full moon was particularly brilliant that night, and it had Jupiter right up there with it. It was kind of like a torch that was leading the way. So
Right. Full moon points, absolutely. Full illumination of the possibilities of expanded awareness. Okay, so I just wanted to, in our, so we don't make this hugely long, okay, just cover a few other issues. Um, I wanted to go back to the difference between physical death and shamanic death, and to give one or two very interesting examples, and then to mention something about suicide and abortion. Um, I'm going to give these two examples that come from my own experience with clients and friends. There's this case of this individual who was just absolutely loved. He was a young guy. He was like 19 or 20, and he was loved by everybody. And it was in Southern California, and I mean, just was like a saint in the community. And one day he's walking along the beach, and out of nowhere, um, somebody he didn't know, for no random, just ran up to him, apparently random, ran up to him and knifed him straight in the heart, and he was killed instantly. Boy, did that ever have a effect on that community. Well, it turned out that they went through this young man's journals, and for the few weeks before this event, he had completed his affairs. And he was in such gratitude, and he basically wrote in his journals about saying goodbye to people and so on. And this just happened suddenly like that, and it was just like apparently, he had other, this is just my speculation, that that was the way that his soul arranged for him to go to, maybe his soul needed to do things somewhere else. He basically done his job, is the way we could look at that. And this is amazing how often this shows up of a person who dies, that they knew ahead of time that it was coming. And there's so many examples of that. And one other example I can give on that is the story of George Harrison, the Beatle George Harrison, who yes, he had cancer, and but it was actually when he passed was at the combination of the Saturn return and the Jupiter return. And if in following that man's life, he was actually in a very good spiritual space. I mean, he had a pretty vital spiritual path. And he wrote and he said to people, he was thoroughly sick and tired of being George Harrison. He was boxed into that identity. And so essentially, of course, that he was complete as George Harrison. And so that was a time period he decided to do, we could say, do something different. I'm only discerning this from what these people actually said, before they passed. And there's similar stories with famous gurus in India, where they might get cancer, and these are individuals that have cured apparently helped other people, cure themselves of different debilitating or terminal diseases. And the disciples will say, "Can't you cure yourself?" And the guru will say, "Well, why should I? I'm finished." So there's a lot of stories like that, which allows us to expand our inquiry, and to not come into, judgment. But I have said, before I get to that last topic, those last two topics, um, I just want to reiterate this point that it really speaks to the spirit of our school's approach and the counseling approaches, is that the purpose of this is not to pass judgment, but to assist the person in their grieving, or even in their non-grieving. Right? Because there can tend to be this expectation, you're supposed to grieve if your mother dies. Well, maybe you don't. That's the truth. And then you can actually get that from, the connection between the mother and the child, and so on. And so these are all very helpful ways of dealing with what no one gets out of, and that is at some point dropping the body, and then having to go through the experience of people we love doing the same thing.
Although they're trying to get out of it with the whole
Yeah.
new fashion of extending the life and the AI and the microchips.
And that's actually the main subject of those books that I've recommended before, the Stephen Fredrickson, Jenkinson books on Die Well and Be Wise and Die Wise, and which is basically his experience of working for 20 years in what he calls the death industry, which is designed to keep people alive as long as possible, and to deflect them from actually dealing with their own death.
What about the number of deaths, the increase in the number of deaths that are occurring all over the world right now, and any particular timeline or transit types of things that you think are
the bottom of Kali Yuga, the 6 converging timelines, the composting,
Turning of the ages.
right.
I mean specifically with the outer planets, telling that story.
Well, I mean, that's a whole longer discussion. I said that for the purpose of our call today, it's just looking at individual charts, but it's always the case that it has to be seen in the larger context. And actually, Dale O'Brien, in our upcoming Preparing for 2025 Council, he will be speaking of the Chironic expression worldwide, relative to the birth chart of Chiron, the discovery of Chiron itself. And it's this plan. He's dealing directly with the plan of the World Health Organization to demantate all these different things that will destroy the human immune system, which it goes into the larger story here. My sense is a kind of a Piscean issue, Mary. What will it take to open people's hearts to what's going on, and to not be dumbed down, not to be numbed down, and say, that's fine, I can live forever as a computer chip in the cloud, and people getting out of, actually, this brings up something I think very important that goes back to what we were planning to talk about here, which is that not only the commitment in our school to have this open-ended, heartful approach to the whole experience we have of people dying, dropping their bodies, but also to on the record saying that as genuine organic human beings, that deathing and birthing and deathing and birthing and the surrender that happens when you go through the bardos even is part of who we are. And to me, and Steiner would agree, that this attempt to extend it into the cloud is actually this egoic desire to get out of having to surrender. And it's anti-human, if I could put it that way. All right. So lastly, regarding the issue of suicide, and now I'm sharing my own personal views now, and I'm not saying that the school has to believe this or anything. See, Rudolf Steiner and some other spiritual teachers tended to be rather dogmatic that suicide is always not to be done. Okay. Now I have a more nuanced view, and some of the charts we looked at, well, like if the judgment was that my first wife had actually suicided herself, it was, to me, it was like an act of art that was taking place, and it was actually, she was gifting herself actually at that point. So I'm not making a judgment like that. And yet, for the most part, a lot of suicides are people who are not capable of dealing with what their trauma or their life purpose issues. And even if it's the type of suicide that where a person does a drug overdose or something like that, you know, and knowingly doing it, you know. So I think it's a case by case basis, and not like yet having said that, oh my goodness, am I have a problem with Canada and Switzerland and certain other places that are advocating people who can't pay their taxes, or they, you know, they can't, you know, deal with their actual objective life circumstances. Here, we can make a death easy for you, you know, which is what is taking place. And plus that very strange situation in Switzerland, where they have euthanasia, you know, where you can sign up to die. You had to demonstrate that you had an injection before they would take you. Serious.
Had not heard that, Daniel.
Yes, yeah, because basically it's part of their, you know, their state-run, you know, medical setup, you know. So you have to go into the hospital in order to get that benefit, that you can die. You know, we can help you die, but you have to make sure you have your shot before you can go in there. It's an example of what a clown world we're in. So lastly, what about the issue of abortion? Now, again, this is my own view, and it could be controversial, which is that I follow the traditions that come from places like India, from spiritual teachers, that have indicated that the soul does not enter into the brain where it can be housed until the second trimester. And so therefore, my view on this is that in the first trimester, imagine a girl, let's say, who's been raped, or a young woman who is manipulated by the guy, or does it because her family told her she was supposed to, or, you know, circumstances, but she just determines, I really don't want to have this child, or I can't manage having this child, or it was a rape, or whatever it might be. The first trimester is fine. You know, it is also the other factor. I mean, to get rid of the child, right? You can choose to not do it because the soul does not enter until the second trimester. And this is a long tradition where there is that understanding. It's certainly not held by the Catholics, you know, or the extreme right wing that it says that all abortion is murder. But even this is nuanced, because there can actually be the agreement between the soul and the mother earlier, and you know, you have to kind of trust that. But I stand for the woman's right to make that choice in the first trimester. But then after that, then it's really the child that is going to make the determination, because if the soul enters into the in the womb, what if it's a toxic womb? You know, I mean, so basically there can be a miscarriage. You know, as far as I'm concerned, that's basically that soul in the fetus that is making that choice. You know, so that's a whole other thing at that point. You know, so it's every case individual. You can't make a black and white thing on it, but I do think that the it's like that long history of saying, oh, we got to look at the conception chart. Well, maybe there's something to the conception chart. However, it's really hard to know when the conception is. And any attempt to try to discern when it is, unless that woman says, I know for sure that my egg invited the sperm in last night, then, you know, it's very subjective. Anyway, that's my take on that. What do you two ladies think about what I said?
As Mary started it by saying that, I don't know if you had that on recording or when we're talking, I've seen it the same, that it's more at that point has to do with the mother child chart and the cycles they have been going through. When I've seen the cases when it was miscarriages or they had to reside for abortion because that was a better choice. Almost always I've seen it in that way, that it was something for the mother. But also there was another thing that I was thinking, and I was wondering if you're holding the same idea as a lot of the older spiritual teachings. I believe like at this time of, they don't word it exactly as turning of the ages, but Kali Yuga, there are more souls that have to come for completion. We understand now that we are going to this whole new archetype of time. So it's like more people, there's more death and there is more birth also, where
Yes.
it can't always happen in
It's Shiva, it's that whole idea that this is not original to me. I mean, which is basically, if you look at the last, say, 13,000 years anyway, and you can speculate further back, way less people alive on the planet, way less. And so if you go over the last 13,000 years, it's pretty much like every soul that has been here, it decides to be here now. And at every level of development, you know, and that's maybe beyond the scope of our conversation now, which would have to do with the nature of reincarnation, you know, and I think it has more to do with like attracts like. You know, so if you that again, let's not, it's beyond our that's a whole other video blog we can do. Mary, you can have the final say.
I really appreciate all this. And I know other things we can talk about is cycles that you might not ever want to conceive in, just because.
Right.
So we can continue the conversation, and I hope that we do get to do that. I've always held close the idea that it's a sacred thing to have loved what death has touched.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, because to have cared so much about someone that you do get to grieve, that you do get to hold those moments that never dissolve or disappear from your memory, that someone gave you, that were just the high points of your life. And
if you genuinely fully grieve, it means you really loved.
oh yeah, oh yeah. So yeah, so this, I mean, it's a tender topic, and depending upon how an individual views death, it can trigger people differently. But especially at Thanksgiving, it triggers my gratitude in a big way, because so many people in my family have gone to the other side, but they've also stayed in contact, and they've also assured me that it's not an ending. And it's fostered a much bigger perspective for me of life.
And very often we're getting that guidance, even to let us know that we can love again.
Absolutely.
So well, this just opens the door for these inquiries, and we will continue onwards. So this, you know, with Mars in the underworld right now, I think it was appropriate to have this conversation now, and I'm sure this will be unfolding even more over the next year or two. So thank you two for being part of this, and it's been a pleasure sharing this. And if this sparks feedback, please do.
Thank you, Danielle, and everyone.